My name is Mira Callahan, and I've never liked family dinners, especially the ones where everyone's pretending we've always been close. That night at Cypress Hall, the whole family gathered to celebrate my mother's 60th birthday. There were candles, soft jazz, linen napkins folded like swans, and my sister Delia already holding court at the center of attention. She wore her signature pearl necklace and that smug smile she saves for occasions when she gets to remind everyone she still lives near mom and dad, not off in some secret base. I was placed at the far end of the long table, next to an empty seat that was never filled. Delia raised her glass and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, at least Mira made it this time." I was beginning to think she only existed in postcards. Laughter, even from the cousins who didn't know me well enough to join in. I smiled because I knew something no one else at that table did. Just past the dessert course, someone would walk through that door. And the way they looked at me, the way they would address me, was going to change everything. Let Delia enjoy her punchline. I had no need to interrupt her story. I've learned over the years, when someone's about to fall flat on their face, you don't stop them, you step aside, and let gravity finish the work. Delia always got the bigger piece of cake. That's not a metaphor. On my 7th birthday, Mom sliced the vanilla sheet cake with pink rosettes and handed Delia a corner slice, the kind with extra frosting and the sugar flour. Mine was a flat middle piece, no decoration. I remember looking at the two plates and thinking, so that's how this works. Growing up, Delia was the one with the medals, the recitals, the report cards pinned to the fridge. I was quieter. Always had my nose in a book, drawing aircraft in the margins of my notebooks, reading about Amelia Earhart while Delia learned how to apply eyeliner from Teen Vogue. She went to prom with the quarterback. I went to the hangar near town and volunteered to help clean old crop dusters, just to be near something that flew. It wasn't that I failed to achieve. I graduated early, joined ROTC, earned my pilot's license before I could legally drink. But no one in my family saw any of that. At least not as anything worth celebrating. "You should really think about something more stable," Mom had said when I got into the Air Force Academy. "Flying planes isn't exactly ladylike." Dad didn't look up from his paper. Delia, meanwhile, married a local realtor at 22, had her first kid by 24, and moved into a freshly painted colonial 2 blocks from our parents. She threw 4th of July barbecues and baby showers. She posted family photos in coordinated outfits with captions like, "Grateful for my tribe," and was always the first to comment on her own posts. I came home for Christmas every few years, when I could. Most times I was overseas, sometimes deployed, sometimes training cadets in remote deserts where the heat came up through your boots and stayed in your bones. The last time I brought a framed photo of me standing in front of a NATO jet, shaking hands with a female general. I gave it to my mom. She smiled, said, "How nice," and within 10 minutes, it disappeared somewhere under a pile of mail. No one ever asked about what I did or what it meant. I learned to stop offering. At dinner, Delia would fill the silence with anecdotes about bake sales and PTA drama, and I would nod, sip my water, and disappear into the wallpaper. There was one moment I remember like a fault line. Thanksgiving, 5 years ago. I was home on a short break between deployments, wearing my uniform because I had no time to change before my flight. Delia looked me up and down and said, "You know, Mira, that thing makes you look severe. Are you supposed to intimidate people or just make them think you do?" I just said, "It's called command presence." She laughed like I'd told a joke. What no one saw, what they never bothered to ask, was how much I'd given up to get here. The nights in foreign barracks, the pressure of flight simulations that judged you by milliseconds, the weight of making split-second decisions with lives in your hands. I carried it all without complaint, because I wasn't doing it for recognition. But I'd be lying if I said I never wanted them to notice. Just once. So when the invitation came for Mom's birthday dinner, formal dress code, private dining room, RSVP required, I said yes. Not because I wanted to be part of the celebration, but because something had shifted. A quiet click, like when a cockpit door seals shut. I wasn't coming home. I was coming to close the chapter. The first time I saw someone salute me, I almost turned around, thinking they meant it for someone else. It was during officer training, and I'd just been promoted to captain. The airman stood tall, eyes forward, hand sharp at his brow. I nodded back, masking the disbelief that bloomed under my calm exterior. I'd spent my whole life being overlooked. Suddenly, I was expected to be seen, to be followed. By the time I made lieutenant colonel, I'd grown into the weight of it. Not the pomp, not the titles, but the responsibility. I didn't command from ego. I led from the front, in flight drills and in hard conversations behind briefing room doors. Pilots under my supervision knew I wasn't the type to bark orders and vanish. I'd be the one up at 0400 doing systems checks before sunrise. My current assignment was part of a joint training program with NATO, preparing elite female pilots for high-altitude tactical operations. It was grueling, high stakes, and intentionally low profile. I couldn't even disclose the base location to my own family. Not that they ever asked. When the program made the cover of Aviation Command Weekly, I didn't send the issue home. I had stopped offering glimpses into my world years ago. After the picture incident at Christmas, the one that disappeared under junk mail, I'd quietly drawn the line. Still, once in a while, the distance stung. Last year, after a particularly rough training cycle, I flew home for a long weekend. Delia hosted a Sunday brunch. She had name cards for every guest. Mine was spelled Mira. When I corrected it gently, she rolled her eyes and said, "Oh, come on, it's not like you're famous." She never once asked what I'd been doing. Instead, she complained about traffic near her Pilates studio and how her neighbor's dog wouldn't stop barking at her new Range Rover. I nodded and smiled. I'd learned how to shrink myself for comfort, hers mostly. But in the world I had built away from them, people stood when I entered rooms. They deferred to my judgment on multi-million-dollar aircraft. They introduced me to visiting officials with full titles and firm respect. I wasn't hungry for attention. I was just used to being acknowledged when I'd earned it. So when the invitation for Mom's birthday arrived, gold embossed, annoyingly formal, I didn't hesitate. It was the first time in years they'd asked me to attend something other than a funeral or holiday. Maybe Delia insisted I be included, just so she could see how the traveler looked these days. Fine. I didn't plan to wear my uniform. But the week before the dinner, I received a sealed packet, an update to the joint training protocols, sent by courier, due for immediate review. The delivery would arrive the night of the dinner. I emailed the officer in charge and told him to forward it to my hotel instead. He wrote back, "Per General Dorsey's instruction, it will be delivered by Lieutenant Reyes in person. The General sends his regards." I didn't argue. It wasn't about proving anything. But after 35 years of being the ghost at my own family table, I didn't mind the idea of someone else walking into that room, looking straight at me, and reminding them I was never lost. They just never looked closely enough to see where I landed. The restaurant was one of those places with too many wine glasses and not enough light. Soft piano music played in the background, and the staff wore white gloves like they were handling diamonds instead of dinner plates. It was the kind of setting that made small people feel important, and gave Delia just enough ambiance to shine. I arrived precisely on time. Not early, not late. Dressed in a simple navy dress, heels low enough to move in, hair pinned up, civilian, unthreatening. The maitre d' escorted me to the long table where my family sat, already half into the appetizers. I got polite smiles from some cousins, a nod from an uncle. My mother barely looked up. My father said, "Oh, there she is," like I'd just wandered in from the parking lot. Delia stood to hug me, air-kissed my cheek, and whispered, "Glad you could fit us into your top-secret schedule." I smiled. "It's classified, but I'll make an exception." She laughed too loudly, turned to the table, and announced, "Mira's back from wherever she's been saving the world." More laughter. I took my seat at the far end, beside a cousin's boyfriend who tried to ask what I did, then gave up when I said aviation training, without elaborating. Across the table, Delia launched into a long-winded story about her latest real estate listing and how exhausting it was staging million-dollar homes for people who don't know how to fold towels. The wine flowed, So did the commentary. At one point, someone asked Delia if she ever thought of moving out of state. She grinned and said, "Why would I? Someone has to take care of mom and dad. Not everyone can afford to disappear for years at a time." Another round of chuckles. Even mom managed to smile at that one. I kept my hands in my lap and reminded myself that small talk was just noise. That these people didn't know the silence of a cockpit at 30,000 feet, the discipline of 3 a.m. briefings, or the weight of calling out eject, eject, eject with steady breath. They didn't have to understand me. They just didn't get to belittle me anymore. We reached the dessert course, some triple-layer cake monstrosity Delia had commissioned from a bakery that used edible gold leaf. That's when a suited waiter approached the table, leaned toward the center, and said, "Miss Callahan, you have a visitor in the lobby. He's requested you step out for delivery protocol." The table went silent. Delia raised an eyebrow. "Delivery? Are you expecting roses?" I stood calmly. "No, just documents." As I made my way through the dining room, heels clicking on marble, I could feel their eyes on my back. I passed the sommelier, the host stand, and turned the corner. There, by the entryway, stood Lieutenant Reyes. Full flight suit, boots polished, bearing stiff and respectful. He spotted me, stepped forward, and, loud enough to carry into the dining room, snapped into a salute. "Lieutenant Colonel Callahan, ma'am. Delivery secured. General Dorsey sends his compliments." Time didn't stop, but it stumbled. I heard silverware pause mid-air. A glass clinked too hard against the table. I held the salute a beat longer than necessary, then returned it with crisp precision. "Thank you, Lieutenant. You may stand down." "Yes, ma'am." He handed me the sealed folder. I thanked him quietly, nodded, and turned, making sure I passed just close enough to the dining room that they'd see his back still straight, still respectful, even as he waited for me to exit first. As I stepped back into the room, Delia's mouth was slightly open. My mother stared at the folder like it might explode. My father cleared his throat, then reached for his wine. I returned to my seat, slid the envelope into my purse, and took a small bite of the overpriced cake. "Sorry for the interruption," I said lightly. "Please, go on." But no one did. The room had changed. They just didn't know how to recover it. And I didn't offer them a way out. Silence can stretch farther than sound. Back at the table, the air was so thick you could have sliced it with Delia's cake knife. Forks were still held mid-air. My cousin's boyfriend, who had barely looked at me all evening, was suddenly sitting straighter. My mother adjusted her scarf, even though it wasn't slipping. My father reached for the wine bottle, realized it was empty, and poured from it anyway. Delia broke first. "Well," she said, forcing a laugh, "that was dramatic. Who even does salutes outside of movies?" Her voice wavered near the end, like even she wasn't sure it was a joke. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The only people who fumble after a salute like that are the ones who don't know what it means, or the ones who do, and feel their world tilt just slightly from it. The waiter brought fresh coffee, but no one touched theirs. My uncle asked if I was really a lieutenant colonel. He said it like someone trying out a new word in a foreign language. I nodded, polite but firm. "Yes, sir. I've been in service for 16 years. 16 years. That number hung in the air longer than anything else I could have said. Longer than the years Delia spent circling backyards with a realtor badge. Longer than the time I'd spent as a footnote in my own family. Delia lifted her napkin to dab at her lipstick, but her hands trembled just enough for me to see. "I just didn't know," she murmured, looking at me, but not really. "No one ever said anything." "That's because you never asked," I replied gently. That landed harder than I expected. Not because it was sharp, but because it was true. For years, she'd asked how I was, in the same tone she asked about the weather, safe, distant, uninterested in the real forecast. She didn't respond. She just looked down and fixed her cutlery. My mother finally broke the silence. "Why didn't you tell us about any of this? The training programs, the officer work. We could have sensed something." I tilted my head. Like the time you sent flowers when I finished flight school? She blinked, confused. Did we not? No, Mom. You sent a Facebook message that said, "Stay safe," and then asked if I could Venmo Delia for a stroller she liked. I didn't say it with venom. I said it like I was filing a fact. But the effect was the same. Her face paled slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. Across the table, a cousin whispered something to her date. Another cousin scrolled her phone awkwardly, pretending not to listen. No one reached for dessert seconds. Delia leaned forward, elbows suddenly on the table, her voice clipped. You make it sound like we've ignored you on purpose. You chose to disappear, Mira. You chose this secretive life. We had no idea what you were doing. I didn't disappear, I said, quietly but firmly. I just stopped chasing people who only saw me when I stood still. That hit something deeper. Maybe a nerve she'd always known was fraying. Maybe a truth she couldn't edit for her version of the story. I stood, smoothing my dress. I appreciate the invitation, but I have a debriefing at 0600 tomorrow. I'll leave you to the rest of the celebration. My mother opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out. As I gathered my things, Lieutenant Reyes, still waiting by the entrance like a statue of precision, caught my eye. I gave a subtle nod. He stepped forward and opened the restaurant door for me, standing at full attention. Every eye in that room followed. Halfway through the doorway, I paused. Not to gloat, not to add one last word, just to exist, to be seen. And I turned back, not to Delia, not to my parents, but to the table as a whole. I serve with people who don't need to understand everything I've done to respect me for doing it. I used to wish that could happen here. I've stopped wishing. Delia didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The room spoke for her. I walked out, heels steady, the door closing behind me with a quiet click that felt more final than slamming it ever would have. The night air outside was cooler than I remembered, clean and bracing. I stood on the curb for a moment, watching as Lieutenant Reyes disappeared into his vehicle. No salute this time. Just a nod. A quiet understanding between people who had long stopped needing applause to know their worth. I slid into my rental car and pulled away from the restaurant slowly, leaving the golden lights and heavy tablecloths behind. Inside, that room was still recovering from the truth. Out here, I didn't need recovery. I had clarity. I didn't hear from Delia after that night. No text, no call, not even one of her performative social media posts about family, forgiveness, and fresh starts. Just silence. And honestly, that silence was the most honest thing she'd ever given me. I returned to base the next morning before dawn. The world was still dark as I stepped out onto the tarmac, clipboard in hand, wind sharp against my face. A new rotation of cadets stood in formation, fidgeting slightly, unsure if the cold in their bones was from the weather or the weight of what was expected of them. They straightened when they saw me. Not because I demanded it, because I'd earned it. No one here cared about how many cousins I had or how often I called my mother. No one asked me why I didn't bring a boyfriend to dinner or why I never posted vacation photos. They cared about my decisions in a storm, about how I held a team together at 40,000 feet, about whether I was someone they could trust with their lives. I used to think I needed my family's approval to feel whole. I don't anymore. Some stories aren't meant to be understood by the people who watched us grow. They're meant to be honored by the ones who saw what we became. Delia will probably tell that night as a funny anecdote someday, how her sister pulled some military stunt and made everything weird. Let her. I'm not here for her applause. I'm here for the sky, the mission, and the silence that finally feels like peace.